Hello, folks. I'm doing a quick book review show just because I enjoyed doing the ones yesterday, and I've got a couple of hours before my next proper live show with Ellen Hampton. So I'm going to talk about books on Pointe du Hoc, the gun battery that lies between Omaha and Utah Beach that everybody knows about, 2nd Battalion Rangers, and talk about the books and the various qualities of them. So we're kind of starting with the worst first, building up to the best. I've got 7 books or something here that cover Pointe du Hoc. I admit I haven't got them all. There are lots of books on Pointe du Hoc. I will mention the ones I haven't got. There's a fairly newish one by Steve Zaloga, which I haven't got, which I expect is quite good. Tim Saunders, the British author who's written prolifically about the Battle of Normandy, has done a new book about Pointe du Hoc in the Battleground Europe series. I think it probably is quite good. There's a Douglas Brinkley book, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc, which I have read. I don't own a copy of it. That's as much about where Pointe du Hoc sits in American subconscious in a way, and it talks about the importance of Reagan's speech in 1984 for the 40th anniversary. So Douglas Brinkley's book is in that same kind of category as Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation. It's talking about something wider than just the Battle of Pointe du Hoc. What I remember about its description of the Battle of Pointe du Hoc is it wasn't particularly good. It was just a bit so-so, really. Nothing special, but some of you my age and older may remember the Douglas Brinkley book as being kind of a classic when it came out, I guess, 20 years ago. But let's start with the books I actually own and the books I have copies of. So we're starting with this one here, Pointe du Hoc by Peter Howard. It's a kind of A4 book, and it's one of those ones I kind of bought on a whim. I was probably on tour. I think it was in a museum, and it's very thin. It's 96 pages. And a lot of it is big black and white photos. And these are actually the standard US Army Signal Corps photos that you can get off the internet kind of free anyway. So do you need them in a book? I don't know. And even when you get a photo like this, which is one of the cool ones, one of the things, if I was writing a book about Pointe du Hoc and I was telling that story or talking about this photo, I would point out that Leonard Goodgall there in the photo with his jump boots is a 101st Airborne paratrooper. That's another story. There's been some things about that on YouTube, who ended up with Raymond Crouch. 2 guys of the 101st ended up fighting at Pointe du Hoc. So I would have included that story if I was going to put that photo in there that big. It's got some lovely photos of the same, the aerial photos, the aerial bombardment, blah, blah, blah. It's got some schematics. It covers the idea, the concept of the Rangers. But it's all a bit lightweight and all a bit lacking in detail and generic, and lots of photos of ships and training and stuff like that. And do you really need to have someone tell you what a Tommy gun looks like in a book about the Rangers? Do you need that? To me, that's what I'm starting with. It is the poorest of the books I've got on Pointe du Hoc. Yeah, nicely printed photos, but you can get them on the internet anyway. So what purpose does it really serve? It's not challenging enough. It's not very detailed. It's omitting some of the detail of the history. So that is the worst book I've got on Pointe du Hoc. And if whoever Peter Howard is, if you're watching this, I'm sorry, but didn't like your book. So that's the first one. Second one is a bit of an oddball, and it isn't available in English. It is Pointe du Hoc by Helmut von Keusgen, a German author. It's available in French and it's available in German. Now, I knew von Keusgen a little bit back in the day, a few years ago. He's a German historian. He's written books on Omaha Beach. And if you can read French, there is, I mean, the benefits you get are some really nice schematics of the bunkers and the casemates and what the guns, elevations and guns and dimensions and measurements, all that kind of stuff. And because it's German, there's quite a lot of stuff about the German participants in the Battle of Normandy. And indeed, Helmut allowed me to pass on some of the German accounts to Patrick K. O'Donnell, whose book I'm going to talk about in a minute, for his book on Pointe du Hoc. So it's good to get a couple of German accounts in there. The problem with von Keusgen is that I just don't believe some of his claims, his assertions, if you like. It's again that there's things he says there about the Germans. There's things he says about the Americans that you're thinking, where did you get that from? What's your evidence for that? There's some nice photos that you won't see anywhere else. There's some interesting details of the Germans using it before D-Day. I say, if you can read, there's even photos about the diving on the site, because he was a diver, or is a diver, and what you can do diving below the cliffs and stuff. So I'm glad I've got it in my collection, but with his other books, No More Heart, and there's one on Vida Stanza 62, I kind of read it now and I go, where did you get that from? You know, it may be true. It may be absolutely 100% correct, the stuff in the book, but part of me tells me, yeah. And Roman, yes, I do have doubts about some of the German testimonies in the book. So I'm glad I've got it, but it's a book that, without double checking some of the accuracy of those German accounts, it falls into that same category a little bit as the Eckert's book, the D-Day German through German eyes book. I've not seen the accounts anywhere else, but it's interesting, and it's worth reading just to get a different point of view. But that's why it's my second from worst book. It's got some value, but I don't believe everything that's in it without more evidence. So, and it's not available in English anyway. So for those of you watching this, like Scott, unless you can read French or German, it's a waste of time anyway. But yeah, pretty poor book. Now the next one is not a poor book. It's a very good book, but it's not about Pointe du Hoc specifically. It's a very good book, and it's Rudder from Leader to Legend by Thomas Hatfield, about Colonel James Earl Rudder. Now I say it's a really good book. I learned a lot about James Rudder, particularly at his time at the A&M University, post-war, his politics, his kind of political campaign, his childhood, his education. But of course, the Pointe du Hoc bit in this is like 10 pages or something. It's quite good because one of the things I got out of this was Rudder's friendship with Colonel Trevor, the British commando, the 6'4" British commando guy who was attached to the Rangers on D-Day at Pointe du Hoc. And I'd heard a little bit about his story, but not very much. But they were best friends for years and years. So this book filled out a little bit about Colonel Trevor that I hadn't found out before. So that was quite cool, but it's not really a Pointe du Hoc book. But I thought, I should mention it because it's a good read. With the size of it, as you can see there, it's all you'd ever wanted to know about James Earl Rudder and more. He's an interesting figure. So it's a good book, but it's not really a Pointe du Hoc book. But there you are. That's my next book on Pointe du Hoc. And this is going to be quite short and sweet, this show, because I'll get prepping for the one later this afternoon. Next one, and actually two by the same author. So you kind of got one, you've got the other. Robert W. Black was a Ranger, not in World War II. And so there's the Rangers in World War II, which covers all the battalions. And the battalion was written later, and it covers just 2nd Battalion. What's interesting about this rather tatty copy of Rangers in World War II, which you're thinking, why hasn't Woody upgraded that to a nice hardback copy? I'll tell you why. This copy was owned by William Elrod Petty, one of the Silver Star recipients at Pointe du Hoc. I just bought it on eBay. It turned up to be his book. So, for example, here, you see the pen marks there? That's where Elrod has marked his own little bit in the book where he talks about going inland and finding the guns. So it was signed to prove, just in case you're doubting it, it is signed there to the man called Elrod from Bob Black, the author. So that's quite cool, that. And then it's a good book. I tell you what also is nice about it, although I expect it's probably out of date now, is at the back of the book you have company rosters for all the battalions. So if you ever meet someone who says that their granddad said they were in 2nd Battalion Rangers or 1st Battalion or whatever, I don't expect the list is definitive. And I believe there's a website now, Friends of the Ranger Family, that has a better, more comprehensive roster. But this is still quite useful. I mean, back in the day, you could look someone up and say, yes, John Smith, D Company, 2nd Rangers, whether it'd be in the back of the book there. So it's useful for that. And it's a good read. Robert Black writes well. And his love and pride of being a Ranger comes through in it. So, and that's maybe where, if I'm being really critical of it, it's not very objective. One of my issues with the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc is there's some questions about the way they fought that battle. I'm not criticizing the Rangers. They were brilliant guys. But when I look at the battle there and I think of, they know that there's no reinforcements coming at a certain point on the mid-morning, they're still patrolling inland. I think there were some tactical decisions made there that are at least worth addressing and analyzing and saying, did this guy do the right thing there? Could they have done this? But the thing is, the whole Ranger ethos is bound up in what they achieved at Pointe du Hoc, and they did achieve amazing things there, and they found the guns inland and destroyed them. But I think now that we're 70 plus years on from the war, we should start really analyzing these events and saying, okay, they were great, but what can we learn? What can we look at when we look at that battle and say, could they have done this better? Could that have worked better? Was this the right decision? And I feel where you get it certainly with like some of the British airborne units, commander units, we're so reverent towards these men now, justly so, that we don't like questioning and analyzing and saying, well, perhaps they could have done this differently. And I think that's why we really need a really good modern kind of David O'Keefe, although he's Canadian style book about Pointe du Hoc. So we can say, okay, let's start again. Let's look at what they achieved. Let's look at it objectively and look at the qualities of the Rangers. Let's look at the negatives of the Rangers. Why were they put into the Keusgen forest later on? Why weren't they used for anything more exciting? Let's talk about the fact they just guarded German prisoners of war for a few couple of weeks after D-Day. That doesn't get talked about. Things like that. There's bigger questions. What caliber of guns did Len Lamel and Jack Coon find inland? Why were some other Rangers taken out of the version of the small unit action at Pointe du Hoc that you guys can just download online? You can find it, right? Is, I think, 72 pages. There's a previous version that's 96 pages that I have a copy of online, PDF that I got from Sandhurst, actually, Simon True there. And the version they finished with was edited. They took out Rapinski, a sergeant who was Jewish, who ended up getting captured. And I'm thinking, why was he removed from the finished version of the Small Action Report? Point I'm making is, I don't want to go down a big rabbit hole. There's things we can look at with Pointe du Hoc now and look at and say, why does this account do this? Why does it go this way? It needs looking at freshly from the start, from beginning, and starting again. But that's a different subject. But Rangers, good book. But I say, because this book is by the same author and came out later, you don't kind of need them both, because it's not word for word taken from the first book, but it is a lot of kind of repetition. What's annoying about this book is I had this book originally signed by Len Lamel. Len Lamel signed it there. Another guy signed it who was on Omaha Beach, and Colonel Blacker. And then later, I got George Klein to sign it when everyone thought he was a Ranger veteran. Now, of course, we know he wasn't a Ranger veteran, so it kind of spoils that now. It's a good, thorough book about the 2nd Battalion. It's actually, if you buy it, you'll be surprised how little of the book is about Pointe du Hoc. There's as much about training, formation, and the fighting after Normandy, which makes it good in some ways. But I feel, again, this is probably 20 years old now when this first came out. No, 2006, 15 years old. It's saying what has been said already well, but there's nothing really new in it. It's nothing really challenging about it. Good book, but Robert Black, being a Ranger, he's maybe not completely objective in his writing about the Rangers. So yeah, and as you said there, Roman, we have analyzed SLA Marshall, analyzed what the Rangers achieved and didn't achieve, and sorry, parity was achieved, and we could do the same with Pointe du Hoc. But in some ways, the public don't want to hear that. The public want to hear how great the Rangers were, how they climbed the cliffs, and there was loads of Germans throwing grenades at them, which really wasn't the case anyway, and they don't want to have their narrative challenged. Anyway, it's a good, solid book without being brilliant. Now, we're now down to my two favorite books on Pointe du Hoc, again, accepting the fact that we need a really good new reevaluation. And the first one, the reason it's not the top book, Patrick K. O'Donnell is my friend. You've seen him on World War II TV. It is a good book. Of course, it's a good book. I get a little thank you in it because I helped him out with some stuff there. But by choosing to write just about Dog Company, it's not therefore a complete book about Pointe du Hoc, because, of course, there are men of E and F, and the commandos and the Navy element, but it does what it does really, really, really well. And Patrick is a great writer, and you get the backstories of all the guys in D Company, lots of nice photos, and it takes you from training right through the end of the war. So here, I guess the Pointe du Hoc bit is a considerable part of the book. And it is a good book, and you only got to look at the back cover, and Joe Balkovsky, John McManus, Alex Kershaw, and various major generals throw lots of praise at it. So clearly, it's a very good book. Because it doesn't cover all the battalions, it can't be my top book, because if you want a book about Pointe du Hoc, it's missing that bit. But it's still a really good read, and he did his groundwork, Patrick. He contacted people in Normandy, contacted German historians. He tried to get around as rounded a picture as you can of what happened there. So that's a good book. But actually, my favorite book, and interestingly, one of the few books about battles that is sort of more than 20 years old now, written by a woman. I've never been able to find a means of contacting her. She wrote a couple of family history books as well. It's JoAnna M. McDonald wrote this one, The Liberation of Pointe du Hoc, the Second Rangers at Normandy, June 6th to 8th. It's a small, little, thin paperback. And she wrote another book called The Faces of D-Day, which I also have. And until something else comes better, I think this is as close as we have right now to a definitive book about Pointe du Hoc that covers all aspects of it. It's quite heavy on detail, which of course I like. So at the back of the book, you have the lists of not just the Rangers, but you have the JASCO teams and who was in which boat. You have the breakdown of casualties, who survived, who didn't survive, who was wounded, the boat teams, boat orders, unloading tables, all that kind of stuff there. And for that reason, the appendices alone are very good. And this came out 2000, so it's 21 years old now. And according to her age, she was born in 1970, so she's in her early 50s like me now. I've never made contact with her, but as a single volume about Pointe du Hoc, this tour guide here, this YouTuber says you can't get better than this one so far. And so I'm specifying so far. She had access to the Ranger Association, so she wrote it when people like Len Nemel and Jack Coon and Elrod Petty and Frank South, the medic, were around. There's lots of photos she used that have since been published. A lot of times were first published back then. So there is a picture of Elrod Petty there on the side there, whose copy of Ranger's book I own. So it would be nice if the photos were a bit bigger in some ways, but it's a good, solid book. I have no idea whether she had visited Normandy when she wrote it. I have no idea what geographic information, but it's pretty sound. She has the guns found in the right place and that kind of detail. So it's as far as I have so far, it is the definitive book on Pointe du Hoc that I have in my collection. But we could do it better. There isn't. I mean, I haven't read the Tim Saunders book, so that may be better. Steve Zaloga's book may be better. You get to the point where when you've already got 7 books on Pointe du Hoc, or 8 of it is, and I've got the small action reports and I've got all my PDF documents and things like that as well, it would have to be a kind of really, really good book, or I'd have to have proof from someone else it was a really good book to go and buy another one. And I've talked about this on other shows, given that Pointe du Hoc now, and I'm not criticizing anybody for doing this, but the ABMC, the American Battle Monuments Commission, the Littoral, the French organization have roped off most of it, and you go through in a walkway now. It's not the brilliant site it was. It's still, the story is good. The site is still impressive to look at, the cliffs and things, but it's not the same place it was a few years ago to walk around. So when I get back to guiding again, I'll be probably trying to persuade my customers to go somewhere else rather than Pointe du Hoc, because I don't want them to be just shuffling around with hundreds of people through walkways. When I was going there back in the day, and you'd be pointing out the details. Like Dave Collins is watching this. Remember, Dave, I would have shown you the different types of concrete. We'd have gone inside the bunkers, shown you the hardened cement bags, all that kind of detail. We'd have walked through the site properly. Oh, and Dave says JoAnna wrote a few books on the Civil War. Were they good, Dave? Were her books on the Civil War worth reading? So, yeah, and Dave remembers going around Pointe du Hoc. So, right now, I'm not at the point where I particularly need a good book on Pointe du Hoc unless one really comes along. But there are questions I have about the battle at Pointe du Hoc. And if ever you're wondering why I haven't done anything yet about Pointe du Hoc on World War II TV, now may be a time to explain why I haven't. And I think it is because, as a Brit, talking about something that is so integral to American history now, I don't want to come across as being disrespectful or knocking this history. I do have questions. There are various things that you hear about. For example, those of you who know, the guns were not found in the casemates, and the French resistance, including a guy called Guillaume Mercader, had warned the Allies that the guns weren't there, and the Rangers went in. And we're still not 100% certain exactly which of the Rangers had been given this update. In terms of, clearly the commanders knew there was a good chance the guns were no longer in the casemates, but whether the privates and corporals had been told that is open to debate. And then on the day they patrol inland and they find at least 3, maybe 5 of the guns inland in this hedgerow that you could read about in the books. Now, I wouldn't hand on heart be able to claim they definitely find 3 or definitely find 5 or 4. I wouldn't be able to definitely say whether those guns were operational or not. I don't know. They found some guns and they disabled the guns they found. Now, another person, a friend of mine, told me that on his deathbed, in the old kind of cliche, Len Lamel claimed that the guns he actually disabled on D-Day weren't 155s, they were 75s, and there's all sorts of questions. There's a story that I've not looked into particularly about the Allies bombing the field inland from Pointe du Hoc like 4 days after D-Day to supposedly cover up evidence of something. And then you get into the whole Maisie Battery thing. I'm not even going to start on the Maisie Battery thing. That's another subject. I have sent an email to Gary Stern, who owns Maisie Battery, months ago, saying, does he want to come on World War II TV and talk about it? Didn't get a reply. But the thing is, if you're anything like a half-decent historian, you will have heard that there are these questions about Pointe du Hoc now, about what caliber the guns were, were they operational, were they not operational. You'll have heard questions about command decisions. Now, when you're writing a book, you've either got to ignore those questions and just tell the story as people in the past wanted to read it then, or you investigate these questions and you decide whether there's any evidence there for them, and you look into it. And it wouldn't be difficult to find out if there was a bombing raid on the field a few days out. We could find it. I mean, there were definitely 155mm guns found in that hedgerow or near there, because there's photos of them. But whether they were the guns then the Mel found, how it connects to Maisie, the point is, if someone wants to take on that subject now, they've got to look at all that stuff, and they've got to, as I said at the beginning of this show, start again, look at all that stuff and say, okay, is there any truth to these suggestions of this, that, and the other? Or they just write the same book that's been written before about the Rangers going up and doing this stuff. And I don't want a book like that. I'd want a book that challenges it. And but as I say, as a Brit, in any way criticizing Rangers, I'm not criticizing Rangers any more than I criticize the 101st or the British No. 4 Commando. It's not criticizing, it's analyzing. There's a difference. You can, for example, someone sent me a message yesterday on Patreon about the Dresden came up. Now, I'm going off on a tangent. It's perfectly acceptable to ask the question whether Dresden was a valid use of strategic bombing. And if you decide no, to still appreciate the concept of strategic bombing as a general form of taking the war to Germany. Those two feelings are not mutually exclusive. You can agree with one and the same thing. You can appreciate the Rangers were brilliant at their job. You can appreciate what they did there was special, but you can also question it as well. You can all, I mean, for example, you read these little online things about the Rangers eliminating hundreds of Germans at Pointe du Hoc. It's about 40 or 50 maybe tops Germans there, and they weren't, it was artillerymen, and the idea of it being this elite guys there, there's these questions to examine. That's the point. If you go look at Pointe du Hoc, look at it with a balanced, nuanced view, with the benefit of 75 plus years of what we know now about the Rangers and what we know now about the side, what we know, and look at it and understand it. And also talk a lot more about the Germans as well. Other than the von Keusgen book that I mentioned earlier, most of the books about Pointe du Hoc don't talk much about what the Germans are trying to do in terms of their strategy. Were the Germans going to allow sites like Pointe du Hoc to become decoy sites to allow the Allies to drop bombs there and actually rely on having their guns elsewhere? These are questions to be asked, because the Germans are shifting. You see, when they start building in 42, it's we will have our guns in bunkers and positions near the coast. Then when we get better intelligence and our bombing gets more accurate and we start targeting these coastal positions, you get more of a reliance on inland and hidden positions, such as the guns at Brecourt Manor and Holdy up in the American Utah Beach sector. The artillery that was found in Crepon, found by the Green Howards, where Stan Hollis earned his Victoria Cross. And there comes to a point where camouflage beats protection, in that you can build a big bunker and put your gun under 10 foot of concrete. You can put your gun under 20 foot of concrete, but eventually the Allies will build a bigger bomb that can penetrate whatever concrete you put above your gun. Camouflage, however, might work better if that you could just have your guns in a hedgerow, but if the Allies don't know where they are, you're safe. So there's much more to be discussed about the German policy decisions that are happening in 44 about how to set up their artillery. And what happens is that we write about the Pointe du Hoc mostly from the Allied point of view, and the Germans become like stormtroopers in Star Wars films. They are simply there to be the people our heroes kill. And we don't talk enough about what they're trying to do, what their aims are, we don't talk about where Pointe du Hoc sits in with the other Widerstandsnest, the things in Grand Comte Maisy, the things inland, the artillery battery. We don't talk about where it sits in relation to the flooding, the protect, and also we don't talk enough about one of the major achievements of the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. It's nothing to do with the guns. It's just securing a section of that coastal road to defend the flank of Omaha Beach. So there's lots of the Pointe du Hoc story that is not yet covered. And why, and again, Scott, why did we not do stuff with them really cool later on? There must have been a reason. Not knowing how to use them, possibly. Maybe there were questions raised about their effectiveness. Maybe there are questions raised about how do you use them? They're not parachutes. You can't jump them out of aircraft. How do you use them? Thing is, now these days, Rangers and Ranger training and the Ranger tab is an integral part of American military culture. It's like, but there was a time when Rangers were new and experimental, and they might not have existed at the end of the war. That's what I've heard. This reduction of the length of this small unit action is that it was written in 45, and there's a suggestion that the Rangers, as a concept, are fighting for their existence. So they want their history to sound really cool and sexy, so that the Defense Department does not remove the Rangers from the military. I mean, now that sounds crazy that we would have considered dropping the Rangers because they're an integral part of US military thinking. But in 45, they might have been thrown away. The Recce Corps in Britain got disbanded in 46. Merrill's Marauders. Some special forces survived, some didn't, and the Rangers did. And part of that is because they told their own story the way they wanted it to be told to ensure their preservation and legacy. So I've gone off on a bit of a tangent again. So apparently JoAnna McDonald is active in the Civil War circuit. So I'd like, I never found with a name like McDonald. It's a very common name, so I've never been able to track her down. She doesn't seem to have a writer's website or anything. But I'd always wanted to sort of write her a letter and say, I think your book is the best, and it's good that it's a book written by a woman as well, because 20 years ago there weren't many women writing about D-Day. There aren't many women writing about D-Day now. And I hope that changes, because I love the perspectives of different people looking at these events. But yeah, Marine Corps Raiders, yeah, disbanded later in the war. So anyway, what we have is my review of Pointe du Hoc books as we have them now. So I haven't read the Tim Saunders one. My hunch is it'll be quite good, but my hunch is it'll also fit in. The Battleground Europe books that it's part of are good, solid, how to walk around the site, how to drive around. They're battlefield guides and histories, and they're really good, but they're maybe not terribly challenging. I don't think they're intended to be challenging. They're really good. I use them all the time. And there's some great writers, Carl Sholetto and Tim Kilvert-Jones, and other people have done some great. Tim Saunders has done books for them. They're good books, and I use them a lot, but I don't think their purpose is to be particularly, here's a new thing. It's more of, here is a solid presentation to enable the battlefield enthusiast to visit a site and understand what took place there in a kind of a slightly conventional but accurate way, if that makes sense. So there we are, Pointe du Hoc books. I may or may not do another show tomorrow. I might tackle Omaha books. I was thinking about doing aviation books. I don't know. But I think this is the way I'll carry on the format. Talk about the books I have and talk about the good qualities and the bad qualities of them. But as I say, just to recap, if you haven't yet got a book on Pointe du Hoc, and assuming it's still available, The Liberation of Pointe du Hoc by JoAnna McDonald is my pick of the bunch, with Dog Company by my mate Pat as a good second, but only not first, because it's just about the men of D Company, not the others. So there we are. That's Pointe du Hoc. If anyone has any other suggestions of books on Pointe du Hoc that I've missed, I haven't read the Steve Zaloga one. I know there's people watching it like Scott and Dave. Have you read the Douglas Brinkley Boys of Pointe du Hoc book? If you did, what do you think of it? To me, it's a bit twee. It's a bit that kind of flag wavy kind of, that phase we went through like 10, 15 years ago, that post Ambrose, our guys are brilliant, everything they did is brilliant, the Germans are crap, and that kind of, aren't our guys just awesome, which is a good starting point. Of course, I have massive respect for our veterans, and meeting veterans is a privilege, but I think it's time now, as they're starting to fade away, to be objective and analytical and question sometimes some of the oral histories, question some of the over celebration of certain units and certain individuals, and say, are we going down the right path with this? And I think the better path is to be more analytical. So there we are. That's my books on Pointe du Hoc, and I hope you've enjoyed the show, and comment down below. And other than that, I will see you in an hour and 40 minutes for our show about the Rochambeau, the female unit who were attached to French Second Army Division in Normandy as ambulance drivers, with Ellen Hampton, who lives near Paris and has studied it and got lots of French sources. It's a really good book. I finished it last week, and the presentation will be rather spiffing. So there we go. So, and then later this evening, of course, we've got Samantha Cowan, a Canadian, coming on talking about remembrance tourism. So how visiting battlefields has progressed, developed over the last 20, 30 years, and how it will be going forward speculating how it'll be in the era going forward post-COVID, when we can hopefully talk about post-COVID. But yeah, if you've got any Pointe du Hoc books that I've missed, let me know in the comments below. And please don't forget to check out our Patreon page. And I'm always talking about it because I need your help, guys. And share on social media and tell your friends what we're doing here. And I'll see you all again. So this is Paul Woodadge for WW2 TV, having talked about Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. Cheers, everybody. Have a good afternoon.